Welcome to the Avenue Bookstore podcast. I'm Anna Taylor. On today's edition, I'm chatting with Betty Churcher about her latest book, The Australian Notebooks. Betty is best known as a former director of the National Gallery of Australia. She also served as the director of the Art Gallery of Western Australia and worked as an art teacher, television presenter and critic. In 2003, Betty realised that she was losing her sight. Determined to continue enjoying her favourite works of art, she travelled to Europe and around Australia, sketching her favourite artworks in an effort to imprint them on her memory. The results from her travels through Australia's art collections are published in her latest work, The Australian Notebooks. I spoke with Betty earlier this month, and I began by asking her how these notebooks first came to be published.
Well, it was interesting. They're both in existence because of Melbourne University Publishing. Because I've had problems with my eyes, I was doing something for the Eye Foundation. And the girl who was doing it, Thea Dakotas, must have known about these notebooks that I did. And she said, could she have a look at them? And then she asked, could she use them in the piece that she was doing? It was nothing to do with art. It was just to do with eyes, actually. And she used it so imaginatively. It was on the 7:30 report, and she used the drawing and she just melted into the image, into the Rembrandt's head even I was seduced by it. But before the program was over, Louise Adler from MUP was on the phone. She said, look, I think we've got a book there. I said, don't be silly, Louise. No, never. She said, I think, believe me, I know about books, I think there is. And of course, that book was a great success. When I thought I was losing my vision, so I thought, oh my goodness, what will I do if I can't remember my best loved works of art? And the best loved works of art then were in the National Gallery London or in the Prado in Madrid, Spain. So I went back to Europe just particularly to draw and to imprint them into my memory so that I could almost paint them. And if I closed my eyes, I could see them.
I'm interested in how the act of drawing a work of art enables you to commit the work to your memory. Is it to do with focusing your attention, or is there something else there as well?
Two things, I think. I say in the book, I think seeing is different to looking. You can look at something and not really see it. But if you stand in front of a work and look at it so that you do see it, and you do if you're drawing it, it explains the work to a certain extent to you, but it puts you in touch with the person who made the work of art. And you'll just notice a line, you think, wonder why she did that. And then you think, because it relates to a line down here. And you wouldn't have perhaps noticed that if you weren't drawing it. The artist John Olsen said to me, he likes this book, he said, you shine a torch into dark places. And I thought that was a lovely thing for him to say.
It is.
Because that's what I've been trying to do.
Your dad had some pretty definite ideas about education for young girls. How did you come to finish your high school and even go on to study at the Royal College in London?
Dad had very definite ideas about lots of things. And one of them was that education spoilt a girl, which I found very puzzling because I could not think, how on earth could education spoil a girl? I thought a lot of Dad and believed what he said, so I really puzzled over this. Unbeknownst to me, the headmistress, who was a person that we were all quite terrified of, Miss Craig at Somerville House in Brisbane, she was very grand, large lady that always walked around the corridors in an academic gown, and we all scuttled if we saw her coming. She evidently rang up Dad and offered to let me continue the last 2 years of school without paying fees. And Dad, of course, could not expound his theory about how education spoilt a girl to Miss Craig. And it tickled me afterwards to think that Miss Craig, she might have terrified us, but she also terrified Dad. He found himself agreeing with her.
So you got to stay at
And
school.
I got to stay on. And it was very important. See, if I hadn't done my leaving, I wouldn't have got into the Royal College of Art.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't have got into the Courtauld Institute later to do my Master of Arts. So it was really, really important to me.
Well, from 1990 to 1997, you were, of course, the director of the National Gallery of Australia.
Yeah.
What was your vision for the gallery during this period?
That's an interesting question because I'd been at the Art Gallery of Western Australia, and I didn't actually initially want to go to the National Gallery. I hadn't applied for the job. I knew that James Mollison was retiring and going to Melbourne, but I hadn't applied for the job. I hadn't thought of it, and I got a phone call from the department asking me would I consider the job. And my first response was, no, not for me, that's not my job. 10 days later, I thought, well, maybe. And I rang up and I said, is that job still going? He said, yeah. I said, count me in. And what I wanted, to answer your question, what I really wanted to do was to raise the National Gallery in Canberra up to a level of consciousness in the minds of all Australians so that it was something that they were aware of. And I thought the way to do that is to put on exhibitions that are outstanding, with works that we would never be able to buy, but that we might be able to borrow. The exhibitions that I pulled together, like the exhibition that Michael Lloyd, one of the curators, pulled together, to be perfectly honest, he used to send me off with a wish list, and I would be the one that would go into the director's office at the Tate and the director's office at the Museum of Modern Art. And I had a great success at the Tate because the director of the Tate said, oh, it's a very good exhibition and we're going to lend you everything you asked for. And I thought, wow, success. Then I went across to New York and I had a very different reception. The head of painting and sculpture at MoMA, which had most of the works that we wanted, didn't want to know about me, didn't want to know about my exhibition. He just kept saying, every time I asked for something, he'd say, no, we don't take pictures off our wall. And I thought, well, that's absolute nonsense. You do take pictures off the walls for the right person and for the right gallery and for the right country. If I was the director of the Louvre, for instance, it would be a different story. But I could see I was fighting a lost battle there, so I stopped talking about my exhibition and I started talking about his exhibition that he'd put on, which I thought was interesting, but the critics had given it a very bad run in the press. So we became quite mates in the end, you know, the conversation went on, and I think he'd forgotten about my requests and that we don't take pictures off our walls. Because as I was going out, he's very matey now, and saying goodbye, and I'm just about to pass out there. Oh, he said, by the way, he said, I'm having a big Pollock exhibition in 1999. We would love to have blue poles. I said, oh, Kirk, unfortunately it's hanging on our walls. And he thought at the first, what's the woman talking about? And then he thought, oh my God.
And in the end, he lent them to you, didn't he?
In the end, he lent them. Michael, who was the curator of the exhibition, would keep poking his head round the door and saying, you're dear Betty now, and then he'd say, you're now my dear Betty. He was getting more and more willing to lend his works, and we got all of them.
Well, let's turn now to the Australian notebooks.
Yeah.
There are some terrific stories in this book about how these works of art managed to find their way into Australian collections. One of the great ones is the work La Belle Hollandaise by Picasso. Mm-hmm. Could you just tell us the story about how that came to end up in Queensland?
Well, that came in 1959. We'd just come out from England in 1957. And the director of the Queensland Gallery was a man called Robert Haynes. He's now dead. But he had become befriended, I'll put it this way, befriended this very eccentric millionaire called Major Harold de Waal-Rubens, who had an amazing collection of modern European painting. Not just Picasso, but Degas, Vlaminck, Renoir. I'm just trying to think of what was in the Major de Waal-Rubens collection. He wanted to give them to Queensland, but in an eccentric way. He wanted to know how they had escalated in value from when he bought them. He bought La Belle Hollandaise in London in 1940 for £4,000.
Okay.
And he wanted to see in 1959 how much had that painting escalated. He said, now the only way to do this is to put it to auction in London. So poor Robert had to convince the Queensland government to allow him to bid for huge sums of money that he didn't have. And the government, of course, was pretty toey about this because they thought, well, what if he doesn't?
He doesn't come good with the check.
Come good and write the check, as he said. Because he kept saying to Robert, I don't care how high it goes, but yours must be the last bid. So the Agent General in London was told to bid. And the Agent General was given exactly the same advice. Your bid must be the last bid. And it did. It went up and up and up. It broke all records for a living artist. It broke a record for Picasso. Picasso had never reached that height. But true to his word, Major Rubens crossed the auction room and wrote a cheque for the full amount. It was over $100,000. And in 1959, that was a lot of money. And the auctioneer, he said, £55,000. He said, of any advance on £55,000. And then he knocked it down. Then he looked to see who'd bid the £55,000. And he couldn't believe it. He said, to the Queensland Gallery? He'd never heard of Queensland. And the sale made news worldwide. And I think it wasn't just the auctioneer was hearing of Queensland for the first time. But it was a terrific purchase because it was a turning point in Picasso's career from his blue, what they called his blue period, to his pink period, and that led to Cubism, and to what was to come. Picasso was only 24 when he painted it. Just a youngster.
Well, before we wrap up, Betty, I need to ask you about Rembrandt. His work features, or a number of his work feature in the Australian Notebooks, works that are held by the National Gallery of Victoria. What is it about his work that so moves you?
What it is he has touched a vein of humanity which I think is eternal. It was there in the 17th century. It was there in the 20th century. It's here in the 21st century. And I'm guessing it will be there in the 51st century. And there's something wonderful about that. That's a great thing about Shakespeare. That's why I love Shakespeare, because he touches on that sort of raw reality of humanity and what it is to be human.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on, Betty. Thank you so much for your time. That was Betty Churcher speaking about her latest book, The Australian Notebooks. This book is published by Melbourne University Publishing and is available at the Avenue Bookstore now. I'm Anna Taylor. Thanks for listening to the Avenue Bookstore podcast.